Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Vietnam Innovators. I'm your host, Hao. Today, we've got a guest from Singapore. His name's Ferish Patel. He's a partner at Cooley. Cooley is a global law firm operating all around the world, including here in Vietnam. And Ferish is on one of his many visits to Vietnam. He just told me offline that he comes here a lot more than I thought. So welcome back to Ho Chi Minh City, Ferish. It's great to have you in the studio.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Thank you to the Century Vietnam for accompanying Vietnam Innovators. The Century is Vietnam's leading social real estate developer and community curator. With a focus on innovation and creativity, the Century are pioneers in Vietnam's co-working and flexible office sector. From grade A co-working spaces that ignite creativity, curated lifestyle events driving community to co-living developments that foster connections, the Century is redefining the real estate landscape ecosystem. The Century, your business launchpad partner in Vietnam. Before we get started, we're going to have some rapid fire questions, some podcasts, the podcast questions, but I'd like for you to just introduce yourself to the audience first.
Absolutely. So I'm Ferish Patel, managing partner of Cooley's office here, in Singapore. I'm a lawyer by trade, and how I relate to the startup ecosystem and the tech ecosystem is that my own individual practice, I'm a strategic advisor to founders, companies, boards on really all activities across the life cycle of a business. Yeah. It could be everything from private capital raises, from early stage fundraisers to late stage fundraisers, companies going public, to also strategic matters. Things like board governance related issues, transition management, succession planning, and even frankly, emergency type situations like, hey, cybersecurity, we've had a data breach. What do we need to do? What regulators do we need to notify? So I've been in Asia for a long time, 15 years, practicing across India, Hong Kong, Singapore, covering all sorts of markets, including Vietnam. And so excited to be here again.
Okay. Well, thank you for that intro. And guys, he's got tons of insights about startups, technology companies, even bigger ones too, of course. So if you have them, drop them in the comments and he'll check them out. All right, Ferish, we're going to start with some rapid fire questions. There's no right or wrong answer. Keep your answers really short. They're all meant for short form videos.
You are talking to a lawyer, so we can't have short answers.
Fair enough, fair enough. All right, let's get started. So first question for you, Ferish. What brought you to Asia?
I had a business plan. I was in New York a long time ago, and had a long-standing interest in wanting to do more work in Asia.
A bit of entrepreneurial spirit. Love it.
Yeah. In a lawyer's way. That's right.
What keeps you in Asia after 15 years of being here?
The energy and the opportunity. It's the single greatest opportunity. And every day I continue to, including even on this visit to Ho Chi Minh, just come across great entrepreneurs that just are incredibly motivating day by day.
What surprises you about this country, Vietnam?
Not much, I got to be honest with you. Look, I've worked across all of South Asia. Like, there are very few markets. Obviously, don't do North Korea. Russia these days is hard for international firms to work with. But having worked across so many different markets, everything from MENA to Australia to the US, Africa, North Africa, Europe, what I find is that there are a lot of commonalities, especially for what we do as a firm and what I do individually or in my own practice, which is you're working with incredible entrepreneurs. And so, every market has its own unique qualities, but there's very little that surprises me, in a negative way.
You had to explain to a stranger what Cooley does. How would you do it?
Since this is rapid fire, we are advisors and supporters to elite entrepreneurs and their capital partners and other parties that support them. And we help them in our own respective humble way scale as quickly as they possibly can. We try to get the noise out of the way.
What's a deal that you've made that you're the most proud of in your career?
I'm going to give you a lawyer answer, and so I apologize about this rather than highlight any one specific one, which is that what I've enjoyed the most, especially the last 15 plus years since coming out to Asia, which has been working with dynamic founders. In particular, my practice has veered more towards representing founders, and obviously their companies and their teams, at every stage of the way, whether it's been an exit to a strategic, going public, raising a few $1 million, whatever it may be. And it's the joy of being able to celebrate as part of a team. That's very exhilarating.
Last question for you, Ferish, before we get into it. On a Sunday at 10 a.m., what would you be doing and where would you be?
Okay. If I'm not hanging out with my kids or family, usually at the gym. It doesn't show, but I do try to try to maintain some kind of a routine. Exercise is some form of meditation for me.
Very good, very good. Great tips. I think for entrepreneurs, it's not just about the legal stuff. It's about tips like that, keeping fit and healthy. All right, Ferish. So thank you for those rapid fire questions.
Sure.
I've brought you onto the show today because when you were speaking at our Vietnam Innovators Summit back in November of last year, you were interviewing two folks. One was the chief operating officer of Bamboo Airways, and the other was the CEO of a digital bank. And a lot of our attendees after said they loved your voice. So today is a radio show, so having you back on here, sharing your voice to our audience, hopefully that sparks a little bit of inspiration for them to reach out to Cooley. So
I had not heard that before. All right.
Yeah, believe it or not, new career for you. Ferish, just offline, we're talking about how often you come here, and in a very surprising way, for me at least, you're coming here pretty often, every month almost, it sounds like. So my question for you is, what's bringing you back to Vietnam these days, and how does that paint a bigger picture about what's going on in this ecosystem?
Yeah. Cooley, we're an international law firm focused on helping entrepreneurs. And so between myself and almost 400 partners, there's someone here almost once a month. And here, of course, it's a big country, 100 million people, big cities. And I think to hit it on the head, which is that Vietnam has been and continues to be a core market for us globally as a firm, and most certainly from Singapore, which, where I operate and which office I lead. And so, we continue to be impressed by the entrepreneurial talent here, the capital seeking that talent, and and all the opportunities that arise from that, and our ability to be supportive and helpful in markets in a country like Vietnam is fantastic. And so, we plan to continue to keep coming here as often as we can.
Okay. You're coming here once a month, and that's just you. You have the other partners compared to...
In a mix. But I'm here almost once every probably like 6-8 weeks.
Okay, got it. That means you're around Southeast Asia quite a bit as the managing partner for the office and region. How does this place compare to these other markets in the region? You mentioned before, a lot of places are similar, and you have the privilege of working with a lot of these elite startup founders or even mature companies. But what are those differences that you could pinpoint if you had to share a couple?
So, it's interesting because every market is unique. I work with a lot of founders, for example, who've scaled into the US. And so if you even look at markets like Silicon Valley and New York, even within the same country, they have, different phenotypes to them and different vectors in terms of their trajectory. And so it's hard to draw a broad brush, but what I would say is that one of the things that I find very impressive about Vietnam, which is true of any place where you have, elite, world-class entrepreneurs and capital seeking to support them, is that entrepreneurial talent here is world-class. Given the fact that, no two markets are the same, everyone has, each market has its own individual, unique characteristics. What I would say is that similarities I see in Vietnam, frankly, not just Southeast Asia, but frankly, anywhere in the world where you have great ecosystems of tech and non-tech consumer founders, is that one, incredible entrepreneurial talent, as well as the fact that entrepreneurial talent has global ambitions. The number of companies that I've been advising and mentoring, and working with, not just entrepreneurs, but kind of the ecosystem, if you will, since maybe 2016, 2015, and the number of companies that I've come across where, of course, Vietnam itself, 100 million people, fast-growing GDP, an economy. There's great opportunities domestically, but the number of companies that I've come across where their ambitions are regional, definitely across ASEAN, but then frankly even global. Like you look at great SaaS enterprise companies that have scaled from here abroad. I think that's another key characteristic, which frankly puts entrepreneurs here on par with any other major hub that we've operated or that I've encountered, including the U.S. And another one that I find interesting is that Vietnam is a draw for entrepreneurs from other parts of the world. The number of founders and companies that, including even from our panel, if you recall, like the CEO of the fintech company was
Polish.
Was from abroad. And these aren't fingertips of one hand or two hands. I see this in the dozens.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because taking the region, for example, the only other country I would say has something similar is maybe Singapore in Southeast Asia at least.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you go to a market like the Philippines or Indonesia, the number of entrepreneurs that are actually from those countries too is usually quite higher. And even taking outside the entrepreneurial box a little bit, let's go to Fortune 500 companies. If I were to do a survey in Vietnam, how many are managed by Vietnamese versus international? It's about split 50-50.
That's interesting.
So something like that. I don't have an exact number, but that's my estimation. But if you go to somewhere like Indonesia, it's probably like 90-95% Indonesian, similar to India. Actually.
Interesting.
And I think that's just because of sheer population. I think Vietnam, it's big, but it's not that big.
Yeah.
I would go to events and, I'm pretty sure someone like you would know, but some people at global events, I would ask them how many people you think are living in Vietnam today. They'd say anywhere from 5 all the way to 100 million. Someone that said 5 million, they're really underestimating
the total
Vietnam.
population of the country. Okay, wow.
When someone said 5, I was like, geez, where are you coming from? Are you reading the news? Or
had they been to Vietnam?
No, they've never been.
Okay,
So they're like very curious. So, Vietnam, you're like the first person from Vietnam I've met. Really?
Yeah.
And going back to that point though, where entrepreneurs are coming from, Vietnam does have really big, rich talent, but the population is very young.
Yeah.
So I think maybe 5 to 10 years from now, will you see like a huge explosion of that group coming out. And in the meantime, people are seeing the opportunity here, so that's why they're coming.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there are a few points there worth unpackaging. One, which is that you're correct. We read about this all across Southeast Asia. Frankly, really all of Asia. You continue that into North Africa, MENA, which is these demographic dividends of the percentage of the population under the age of 20, under the age of 30. And you combine that with the internet and fast evolving technologies. So the opportunity set's amazing. And you're right. I think that with all due respect, there's so many great entrepreneurs, but you're going to continue to see more and more, and that's why we like coming in early to markets and helping support them. I think a second thing that's interesting is that you've probably heard the term sea turtles, right? And so I think I recently read a stat as I was just prepping for this, which is that the percentage or the number of sea turtles that return, number of Vietnamese who've gone abroad, been educated abroad or worked abroad and coming back, mirrors what something I had seen and have continued to see in markets like India for the better part of the last 10, 15 years, where you see this amazing entrepreneurial talent coming back. Third, you're absolutely correct. The number of founders, there was an event within the last 6 months that I went to where it was kind of like a startup launch event. And almost every single one of the entrepreneurs was from abroad, lives in Vietnam now. This is home for them. There's a fourth point that was interesting, which is that, we were talking a little bit offline about, misconceptions about Vietnam. I think one of them is that people actually don't grasp the size of the market. 5 million, if that's the size of it, that's Singapore. Right. It's a huge, huge market.
It's a huge place and a lot to be done. My next couple questions, I'm looking at the list that we drafted here from the team. You mentioned you work with elite entrepreneurs, and that means your deal flow must be insane in a good way. Like you're meeting the top entrepreneurs, top companies all around the world. And so my question for you is from a Vietnamese point of view, out of the entrepreneurs you have the privilege of meeting, what kind of industries are they representing? What kind of technologies are they building? Or maybe it's not even technology, maybe it's something else. Maybe you can highlight some of those themes, especially for the investors that are listening on today's podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a firm, we focus on what's called the new economy. I mean, there's different ways of rubricizing this, but one way you could say is we're venture capital, or you could say we're technology. Really, it's kind of anything that's high growth, fast, innovative, and that could be anything from a B2C business to something related to AI, or back when crypto was what we would talk about, probably a couple of years ago, SaaS enterprise, fintech, biotech as well, and even frankly on the consumer side as well, right? So that's a broad swath. So sectors that I have been, again, there's no shortage of businesses doing broad-based consumer-facing businesses, and you have a lot of the regional players like Grab, others who are here. I think things that I have found very intriguing are businesses like edutech, again with global ambitions, obviously applications to Vietnam, but frankly, anywhere in the world. Fintech, seen the same. A big one has been SaaS enterprise businesses. Again, if you go back to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, why are we spending so much time in Vietnam? Why are we continuing to come here? It's an amazing place. The entrepreneurial talent here doesn't view the opportunity set as only, hey, I'm only going to, focus on the 100 million people here in Vietnam or just ASEAN. There are global applications to these businesses. And we've seen quite a number of them scale, across the globe that way.
Let's talk about key challenges. You mentioned a lot of Vietnamese companies are thinking global, they're going abroad. From my view, some have stumbled along the way. They kind of paved the way for their successors to then succeed. What are those challenges, would you say, and how are they navigating them?
So a few thoughts. One, there's all the table stakes related stuff that any entrepreneur has to go through, right? And if it's most of the audience is entrepreneurs, they understand what the crazy associated with that, which is high growth, making sure that their business scales, talent acquisition, all of that, right? So you remove that, which is table stakes for any great business and entrepreneur. Then I think one of the challenges, and this is not specific to Vietnam. Yep. I see this in a lot of emerging economies, which is that capital mismatching, right? The challenges that entrepreneurs and their businesses have to go through to be able to find capital is much harder than, say, if you were sitting in Silicon Valley or in somewhere in the Midwest of the United States.
Well, let's talk about mismatch, though. So do you mean mismatch in terms of the fund and the investor not understanding the startup and vice versa? Or is it just like a lack of capital?
It's kind of a combination, right? There's already an amazing echelon of good early stage funds here, and similar to what we've seen in markets like India, China, Southeast Asia, Singapore, is that over time, right? Like, where do you get that growth stage capital? Where does that late stage capital come in? So there's a little bit of not so much an absence of it, but not enough of a presence of it, right? I mean, think about it this way. Think about all the funds that we've talked about offline, or that we all know about, right? They're covering a market that is Southeast Asia. You strip out even some of the smaller players, that's still 500 to 700 million people, depending on how you size the market. That's massive, right? And so for any one given fund or a set of funds to be focusing on such a large market, the US is 350 million people, right? And usually most funds are focused on West Coast or New York. So it's where the capital mismatch occurs from is that it's hard for, this is just life, it's hard for bandwidth and focus to be centered on any one particular market. And I think it's, and then to your other point about, our companies, our investors getting it, actually I think that and you see this in the early stage and growth stage deals that occur here, there is that match occurring. It's just, there's bandwidth diversion because there's so many opportunities across Southeast Asia, and a lot of LPs, international investors, kind of treat Southeast Asia as a basket,
Is that a problem, you think?
It's a challenge. But if you look at, again, other markets across Asia, look, capital, this has been observed for centuries, which is capital will find opportunity. Sometimes it has to overcome higher hurdles. And we've seen this China. Funny to say that now, but if you talk to my colleagues who were doing this decades ago, India, which we've seen, over the course of my career, other markets in Southeast Asia, it overcomes that. It's just time.
So I have a follow-up question there. And the bigger markets like China, India, and to some extent Indonesia now, who's filling those growth stage funds? Is it family offices? Is it those big domestic companies? Is it the international LPs like the Sequoias of the world who come over and set up Sequoia India, et cetera? What is happening in those markets, and what do you believe could happen in Vietnam? Could is a key word.
No, look, I mean, right, the story is yet to be rewritten, is yet to be written. I think it's a combination of, but even within the investment community, you see their own entrepreneurial journeys, right? So yes, family offices, depending on which way you view a funnel of capital, whether top or bottom, there's family offices, and then, kind of endogenous or domestic early stage funds. We've seen that there are quite a number of great early stage focused funds. Then you also have international or regionally based funds that are now setting up offices here. Then you start getting to things like, say, growth stage and later stage capital. It's oftentimes international GPs that either have regional offices focused on the market. And then frankly, to that point about the entrepreneurial journey of investors themselves, you see great investors who see such an incredible opportunity in markets like Vietnam, and where the story could go is that they'll raise their own growth stage or late stage focus funds for this market. And that's what we've seen in Indonesia, we've seen it in India, we've seen it definitely in China, and quite a number of other markets as well.
Let's talk about the entrepreneurs that you're working with here. From what I see at least, and most startups are like that globally too, young, dynamic, But especially here, I feel like, and I'm a victim of that, a suspect of that actually, because we're not seeing it from as big of a global perspective, how we do business, even corporate governance and things like this. Like we only recently really beefed up our corporate governance in the last 12 months. We have a professional CFO. We take legal very seriously now.
Got it.
Yeah, here at Vietcetera, but Vietnam, generally speaking, too. So my question for you is, how does Cooley approach and connect with entrepreneurs in Vietnam, knowing that their corporate governance sophistication is not there yet? I think people are starting to wake up and realize, like, hey, to fundraise with those growth funds, we need to get there. Do you see, is that an obstacle to Cooley, or is there enough entrepreneurs that actually know this, or at least curious enough about it?
It's definitely not an obstacle. We view it as, a fact pattern. It's a fancy way of saying a state of affairs that where we, along with many other players, can help navigate and overcome. And truth be told, even a business, even your business, this business, right? If you were to draw up the checklist of, right, like best practices, it's kind of the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like there's no shortage of things that you could be doing. And, for early rising, fast growing businesses, how much of your bandwidth can you focus on? Or can you focus it on every best practice? It's hard to do, right? That's the nature of scaling. So when we look at markets like Vietnam or any other emerging market, I think one is, of course, look, there's the day job of what we do, advising companies on fundraising or data privacy related matters, IP, commercial licensing, whatever that may be. But I think, frankly, a lot of what, in fact, what this trip has been for me is that it's sharing IP, and I mean that in a loose way, freely in the market. I'm doing, this is going to sound extremely unexciting, but tomorrow I'm doing a presentation on how to set up a holding company.
Actually, that's very exciting. I think for entrepreneurs, they have no idea.
You're making me feel good, man.
I made a really big mistake of setting up a holding company in the wrong way
here in Vietnam
6 years ago.
Okay.
Or in Singapore, or the relation between the two countries. Having to kind of unwind that and then reset it in the right way for having the best commercial corporate governance set up, everything. It didn't cost a lot. It was just time.
Yeah,
it was mostly just time. It was not about the money. And it's not that I regret it, but I do wish I had that best legal counsel from the very beginning. I do believe I worked with the wrong lawyer from the beginning. And hence why I've invested so much more energy since then. So
I appreciate you making me feel good about the
really,
presentation.
No, really, I think entrepreneurs listening today, and hopefully the investors investing in them, they need to demand more out of this, even at the earliest levels, because if they really actually plan to invest in a company that scales, which you would hope at the seed level, right? It starts at the very beginning, and the corporate governance and the thinking about this from the beginning is really lacking in Vietnam too. Sorry, this is more of my sharing to you, I guess.
No, I appreciate hearing that, actually.
Because like things like the legal system here, it's not as sophisticated as a Singapore, which is like almost overly complex in a certain way, right? But that also bleeds into the, I guess, mindset of entrepreneurs here that, hey, how we approach taxes can be a little bit different, or how we approach, just doing co-founders agreements or something like that is something not discussed at scale here in Vietnam. So
it's, I was looking at some data, food for thought in terms of where I think that the importance of this, like it's self-serving, of course. Let's just start off with the obvious, which is it's self-serving to say, hey, go out there and get a good legal advisor and other advisors, right? But even discount that, to your question, a lot of what we're spending time here, and not just myself, a lot of my partners are doing as well, which is that, it's like what I say, free IP, it's educating the market, right? And it's kind of putting resources out there, making ourselves available, really. Like people ping me all the time with like questions, and my partners and colleagues with questions about, hey, proper corporate governance or equity incentivization. And you'd be surprised how much we put, and other great firms do, like put things out there like free. Like, we've talked about Cooley Go in terms of like fundraising related data. We have an entire practice portal on data privacy, and now in terms of alternative data, and no shortage of resources. And we're trying to put that out there to help overcome the gap, which is natural, which would occur anywhere for, founders, entrepreneurs, startup ecosystem to just, to grow that way. So it's, again, to your question, do we view that as a rate limiting factor to us participating here? No, we actually view it as part of like what our job is to help, empower the market here.
What's some misconceptions about the Vietnamese ecosystem? Well, and let's answer in two ways. So one is, before you started doing business here as a partner at Cooley, however many years that was ago? And the second part of that question is from your current clients. What are their misconceptions when they think about, oh, hey, Ferish, we need to set up a legal framework because we're launching in Vietnam. Like, could you advise us? And what questions do they have? What misconceptions do they have? So let's start with you at a personal level many years back, and then today with companies.
It was actually not really appreciating like what the market was, size, TAM, opportunity, where were the growth areas. Frankly, like probably the first time I came here, I don't know, let's say within the last 10 years, maybe 8-10 years ago, probably didn't really know what the core drivers of the economy were. You know, everyone has historical reference points, but I really didn't understand, and it wasn't until, you know, you come see it for the first time and you're like, wow, this is amazing, right? And then you study it a little bit more, dissect it, understand, read up. So it was in many ways a little bit of what you were describing, that person, you know, the person or people, wherever it was like, hey, it's like 4 million people or 5 million people, right? So it was misconceptions about what the actual size of the market and the opportunity set was.
Is there enough content out there about Vietnam in your opinion?
At the time, no.
How about today?
It's available, but you have to go track it down. You know what I mean? And it's not front of mind. If you look at other markets that definitely, you know, in the emerging developing market rubric, there's a lot of stuff out there that, you know, you could pick another country or another market or another town, another region, and people can start rattling off stats or names. It's a little bit harder, but it's out there.
Yeah, I was just watching a documentary last night about BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And I'm looking at the group of countries, and the whole documentary, by the way, was about how this organization wants to invite more countries into this. Like,
I've been reading about this.
And you would think like Vietnam, for instance, Philippines, and whoever else. And I was looking at the list. I was like, okay, you know, India, China, for sure. I mean, they're massive, and that obviously makes sense. Russia, personally, you know, perhaps not as much given the war at the moment, but still a massive country. Brazil, a couple 100 million, I think, 250 million person population. So it's actually a lot bigger than people think. South Africa, that was a strange one in my opinion. I think 10 years ago it was very, very attractive, but it hasn't hit the heights perhaps that it had hoped, and but still has huge potential just given the population size and its role in Africa. And I think, you know, those 5 countries benefit from those organizations, but Vietnam is kind of clumped into this ASEAN. And what does ASEAN stand for? It's like all of Southeast Asia. And that's a double-edged sword, I guess, in a way. And
totally. It's kind of like saying Asia, right? You know what I mean? It's almost like it's an all-encompassing, but it has a tendency to dilute the individual value of it, right? Because it becomes so large. Asia is over half the world's population. ASEAN, by the way, you know, 800 million.
So it has to be quite intentional, it sounds like, to hunt down this content. It's out there. But not as obvious.
It goes it goes to a point that you said earlier, which is that, look, like, you know, how potentially could one way in terms of that capital mismatch be addressed? You already see now great regional funds that are focused on Southeast Asia. They're in that growth stage, early to growth stage segment. The content that they put out, I mean, you know, we all get it because we're all in the email threads and the newsletters and everything, and we're reading up on it. But there's a lot of info on there, and over time, I think that you will continue to see more focus on that. Obviously, you know, some of the geopolitics that plays into it, I think continues to amplify Vietnam's focus. I would say in the last like 2 quarters, the number of articles that I've read, and pick whatever newspaper, talking about Vietnam and the opportunity and supply chains relocating here. That's just part of that natural order to your point. You know, how does this potentially unfold is that I think organically there's a lot more awareness of, you know, how big is Vietnam? Like, what are the opportunities here? And then through that, you know, what's the great entrepreneurial talent that exists here?
So the second part of my question, moving to that, would be what misconceptions your clients might have. So is it a repeat of what you had 10 years ago? Is their understanding of the, you know, market entry a bit limited or perhaps just wrong? What's some of the recurring themes that you're seeing? I
think it's 2 things, right? One, which is that, you know, it's a little bit of bandwidth diversion oftentimes. And I guess it depends on which, you know, kind of what's frame of reference. A lot of clients are Vietnam based. And so for them, it's, you know, right. So I'm presuming you're asking about, you know, clients that are maybe, say, looking to expand into Vietnam, right? I think one of it is that it's a bit of bandwidth diversion, right? Like, you know, like you're looking at let's roll out into Southeast Asia, or let's expand into that. And each one of these is unique markets. I mean, you take take even Vietnam, between, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, like very different segments. So in many ways, kind of how I was describing San Francisco and New York, right? Like, you can't just roll into San Francisco and then roll the same playbook out into New York if you were, doing tech investments or helping companies. So I think that's number one, which is that it's being able to have the time to focus on. You've seen companies that have done it, and they've done it well, but it's required a lot of heavy resource focus, because the same playbook, I mean, as obvious as it sounds, you'd be surprised how often this happens, that the same playbook, believe it or not, in Malaysia doesn't work in Vietnam, right? I mean, unique markets. And actually, I would just focus on that as like the biggest concern, because it's not so much of a lack of, hey, we're not interested. People get that it's a huge market. It's just oftentimes kind of, hey, let's do Southeast Asia all in one go. And that's hard to do.
Let's take the flip side too. So Vietnamese companies going global. This is a huge trend. I remember when we started Vietcetera 7 years ago, it was mostly manufacturing and outsourcing, services-based, commodities-based, trade. But it's also become like brands. So, for example, 7 years ago, one of my favorite brands, I'll do a little shout out, Maru Chocolate. Not technology, but craft and high quality product.
So we were talking about consumer earlier, right?
Consumer
like it doesn't have to be like a website. It doesn't have to be
exactly.
Yeah.
I
get it.
And they've been fairly successful. And then you have furniture brands, let's say, and it's gone all the way up to cars now. There's electric vehicles being made in Vietnam, being sent and sold in the U.S.
Totally.
But with that comes a lot of challenges. Comes a lot of hiccups, I'm sure. So from your role as an advisor and as a lawyer as well, what's it take for these Vietnamese companies to make it big on the global stage? What are those misconceptions within or outside of the legal framework as well? Maybe you can drop some comments there.
Yeah, I mean, look, because there's no shortage of challenges that I'll restrict my answer to kind of my niche or our niche, which is, I think, and it's no different than companies scaling here, which is that whether it's regulatory or country-specific challenges, if you wanted to scale and start selling, vehicles or products of any sort into the United States, it's understanding, okay, well, what's the regulatory environment there like? Can I just sell stuff? And look, these are sophisticated companies, so they get, hey, look, like we have to study, we have to understand market access. But understanding, say, for example, that, hey, getting the right set of advisors, people who are actually like competent in, doing this, have had experience with it. Sometimes I've found that there's a hesitance to want to not arm up, but like to surround yourself by the right set of advisors to help you with, or to help companies as they expand globally. And that can result no different than companies coming here into Vietnam or into other markets in ASEAN, which is that, again, sounds obvious. You'd be surprised how often it happens where, okay, hey, we didn't realize that this regulator takes it this way, or, or views it this way. And so now we have challenges associated with building that manufacturing plant or selling our product into this market. It's that's very high level. I think the key part is that one of the key challenges that companies face, which is that they've got a great, they've got a great service, they've got a great product, they've got a great offering, they've got a great team, but it's making sure that they've surrounded themselves by the right advisors to be able to help with market entry into markets like the US or EU or even other parts of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I was reading on the news lately that the electric vehicle brand VinFast, they're beginning to make pretty good strides in Vietnam, but of course a relatively unknown brand in the US. Big challenge, a big opportunity, you can say as well.
Totally.
And one of the biggest challenges is the EV tax credit. So about the federal and state level. And part of the Inflation Act that was passed by Congress was any vehicles that have a certain percentage made in America, like supply chain or whatever, gets a subsidy. That's great. I think for consumers, I mean, let's not comment about the debt ceiling, but about consumers adopting a new technology, wonderful. And for the companies, they love it. They're going to invest in America, which is exactly what's happening. VinFast is building a factory there. But unfortunately, they, at this very moment, don't qualify for the credit. And they might be very soon, according to reports I've read, which is promising for them. But it's tough. And I think having that set of advisors, either proactively or retroactively, making sure that these new entrants to the global stage are armed with that right information, it's really key. When I read that, I was like, I mean, new laws are passed all the time, right? But how do you make sure that you're ahead of the curve and being competitive.
It's a perfect example, and not to localize it to VinFast, but take the Inflation Reduction Act, right? I mean, the number of articles that I've read exactly about this that have talked about, hey, companies, and take it a little bit and, dissect that example. It could be any company that is trying to avail of itself of the IRA or the CHIPS Act, for example, right? Like these great opportunities to be able to help scale your business. If you, right, like it sounds high-minded or high level to say, well, you've got to have the right advisors to be able to get into the market. You go to your board, you go to your shareholders. Even worse if it's, say, a public shareholder base, and say, hey, we're going to launch into the United States, and and look at all the great opportunity, look at the TAM, and here's how we plan on doing it. But if you're not properly guided and supported in that process, the potential for letdown, and not just letdown in a generic sense, your shareholder base can become very quickly disappointed if, hey, that big pop in our stock price associated with, launching in the US or launching in, Timbuktu, wherever it may be, that has repercussions on the management teams, expectations from the board who are stakeholders watching and sitting here saying, wait a minute, like you didn't think about this, or how did this issue, and that's why when I say it sounds obvious, but it happens all the time in business. And that goes to your point, and much appreciated you highlighting that, which is that, surrounding yourself by the right set of advisors avoids a mismatch between expectation and output when companies, especially as they try to scale geographically and abroad.
Ferish, we need to be a bit cognizant of time.
Yeah. It's always a challenge. I get paid by the minute, so I go long.
By the way, if you're listening to this podcast and have a lot of follow-up questions, and there's a lot of topics we haven't covered, including M&A, deal-making, investment. We host a lot of offline roundtables, and Cooley is joining us for one right after this podcast, actually. If you're interested in these kind of topics, just drop your information in the comments below. We have a forum where you can sign up for future events hosted by Cooley and other companies. We can share more then. But what I want to touch upon here is the topic of M&A I mentioned, and deal-making in general. There's a lot of chatter about how tons of excitement about Vietnamese companies, where they're going, the market potential, but we also have to think about the outcomes. And in the startup world is a few. You can fail, you can become a great cash flowing business, M&A, merger and acquisition, or IPO. And out of all those sets, failure is not an option for your clients, hopefully. Yeah. The second one is cash flow, depends on the nature, but if it's venture-based, probably not on the table. And then it leaves you with the other two, M&A and IPO. Yeah. So my question is, how often do you think Vietnamese companies are thinking about those outcomes? And are they realistic compared to the other markets that you're in, like Singapore and whatnot? I'd love for you to maybe just comment on that high level. Are your clients thinking about that? Are they thinking about it reactively or proactively?
Specific to M&A?
Yeah, M&A. Or even the other outcomes, but let's start with that.
So it's an interesting question, right? So I think almost any company that has raised private capital from institutions faces that question, obviously not from day one, but like, smart capital will ask the question, what do you envision the exit plan for this business to be? Does it get sold to a strategic one day? Is it go public, right? And, in the early days, no one's going to hold the founders and their team to that answer, but over time, that question needs to continue to be teased out, which is that, how much longer is funding required? When does a business become profitable and just, cash flow, EBITDA positive, for example, or net income profitable? So I think it's always on the roadmap. Just the question of how front and center on the mind is it? Yep. And obviously, the more, not surprisingly, the more capital you raise, the later in the business you get, the more those questions become acute, which is that develop a clear roadmap towards M&A. I think a little bit off piece from your question, but one thing that I've been thinking about a little bit is that one of the things that I think companies, in terms of challenges, in terms of how companies can level up, and it's not just Vietnam, it can be anywhere, is that thinking about work streams like M&A, sure, okay, hey, our investors, our board are asking us every year as part of our annual, business strategic planning, exit outcomes, like, what are we thinking, what's the roadmap? But a lot of times what I see companies respectfully not do as well is treat it like a work stream, like any other project that you would do in your business, right? And regularly through the use of bringing on board advisors. It's really not an expensive proposition when you're doing the strategic planning aspects of it and thinking about it once a quarter. What are we doing for M&A prep? What should we be doing for M&A prep, for example, if that's the outcome, or if it's towards public capital markets, whatever it may be.
Interesting. So very fascinating. I think me as an entrepreneur myself, I only really started thinking about that in the last 24 months, let's say. I've been doing this business for 7 years, and I selfishly asked that for my own insight. I know a lot of entrepreneurs everywhere listening to this podcast, but especially Vietnam, are perhaps not thinking about it enough or too soon. So thank you for sharing that, Ferish. I really appreciate it. Guys, if you enjoyed today's podcast, you can drop some comments below. You can reach out to Ferish. We'll include his LinkedIn on the description.
Please.
You can reach out to him. And of course, again, if you're interested in any of our offline events through the Vietnam Innovators series, you can drop your information in the form below. Ferish, thank you for sharing your insights, mostly legal and advisory side of things, of course, and those macro conditions. Always a pleasure to hear from experts like you. Good luck on your visit, but of course your next visit to Vietnam as well. And would love to have you back on the show in the near future.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right. See you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.